There's a strange gap in humanity's genetic code, a kind of scar tissue in our DNA that shouldn't be there if our species had always thrived. Every human alive today carries evidence of something that almost erased us completely, and scientists are still arguing about what that something was. Here's the strange part. If you compare the genetic diversity of humans to almost any other species on Earth, ours is oddly, suspiciously low. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show more genetic variation within a single group living in one forest than the entire human species shows across every continent combined. That shouldn't be true. We're the ones who spread everywhere. We're the ones who adapted to ice sheets and deserts and rainforests and islands. A species that's successful should be genetically messy, full of variation, full of different experiments that worked in different places. Instead, we look like a population that went through something that squeezed almost all of that variation out. Let's go through it properly. Start with the most dramatic version of the story, because it's the one that gets repeated the most and it deserves to be taken seriously before it gets picked apart. The claim goes like this. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano called Toba, located on what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra, erupted with a force so extreme it remains one of the largest volcanic events of the last 2 million years. The eruption didn't just destroy the surrounding region, it threw enough ash and sulfur into the atmosphere to trigger what researchers call a volcanic winter, a multi-year period of dramatically cooled global temperatures, reduced sunlight, and collapsed plant growth. According to this theory, the Toba eruption devastated the food supply across huge portions of the planet, and the human population, then confined mostly to parts of Africa, crashed from what may have been tens of thousands of individuals down to a number small enough that our entire species came within a hair's breadth of disappearing. Somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding adults. Not 10,000 humans total, spread comfortably across the globe. 10,000 people, in one moment in history, responsible for every single person who exists today. That's the version of the story you've probably heard, if you've heard this story at all. A volcano nearly ended the human species, and we clawed our way back from a genetic near-death experience. It's dramatic, it's specific, it has a villain, and it has a number you can repeat at a dinner party. And there is real evidence behind parts of it. But the actual picture, once you look closely at what the evidence supports and what it doesn't, is more complicated, more contested, and in some ways more unsettling than the volcano story alone. So let's look at what we actually know. The genetic evidence for a bottleneck is real, and it's strong. When geneticists study the DNA of modern humans, they look for something called genetic diversity, essentially a measure of how many different versions of genes exist across a population. High diversity means a population has stayed large and varied for a long time, with lots of different genetic lineages surviving side by side. Low diversity is what you'd expect to see if a population had, at some point, been reduced to a small number of individuals, all of whose descendants would then share a much narrower range of genetic variation than a larger population would have retained. Human genetic diversity is low, lower than gorillas, lower than chimpanzees, lower than many species with far smaller total populations than humans have today. This isn't a fringe observation. It's one of the most consistently replicated findings in human population genetics, and it strongly suggests that at some point in our species' history, the population size dropped dramatically, and every human alive today descends from whoever survived that drop. Where the story gets contested is the timing, the cause, and the severity. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis specifically ties this bottleneck to the Toba eruption around 74,000 years ago, and there is genuine physical evidence for the eruption itself. Ash layers from Toba have been found across South Asia, thick enough in some locations to represent a serious, sustained environmental disruption. Ice core samples from Greenland show a period of unusual atmospheric composition consistent with a large volcanic event around that time. Nobody seriously disputes that Toba erupted, or that it was enormous. What's disputed is whether Toba specifically caused the human population crash, as opposed to simply happening around the same general period as a population decline that was already underway for other reasons. And the evidence here is genuinely messier than popular retellings suggest. Some archaeological sites in India, sitting directly beneath thick layers of Toba ash, show continuous stone tool traditions immediately above and below the ash layer. In other words, whoever was living at those sites doesn't appear to have experienced a total collapse. Their technology continued. their presence continued. If Toba had triggered a civilization-ending, population-crushing catastrophe everywhere it reached, you would expect the archaeological record directly on top of the ash to look different, disrupted, abandoned. At several sites, it doesn't. This is where paleoanthropology runs into one of its recurring problems. A single eruption, however large, doesn't affect the entire planet uniformly. Some regions would have experienced severe, extended cooling and ecological collapse. Others, depending on wind patterns, geography, and existing climate buffers, may have been affected far less severely. A population living in a resource-rich river valley might have weathered a temporary cold snap that would have been fatal to a population already living at the edge of survival in a marginal environment. The genetic bottleneck could be real, severe, and species-threatening, while the specific claim that Toba was the singular cause remains scientifically shakier than the popular version of the story implies. There's also a timing problem. Some genetic estimates for the human population bottleneck point to a period before 74,000 years ago, potentially by tens of thousands of years, which would place the genetic crisis before Toba erupted at all. If the bottleneck predates the eruption, then Toba can't be the cause of it, no matter how dramatic the eruption itself was. Other genetic models place the bottleneck later, or spread across a longer, more gradual period rather than a single sharp crash. The honest scientific position right now is that human population size did drop dramatically at some point in our deep past. The genetic evidence for that is about as solid as population genetics gets, but the specific claim that one volcano did it in one identifiable moment is a much shakier, much more contested piece of the story than the version that tends to circulate. So if it wasn't necessarily one eruption, what's the alternative explanation? And this is where the story becomes less cinematic, but arguably more accurate. The leading alternative isn't a single catastrophic event at all. It's a prolonged period of severe climate instability across Africa, where early modern humans were living at the time. Between roughly 190,000 and 130,000 years ago, and again in later cycles, parts of Africa experienced repeated, severe drought phases, driven by long-term shifts in monsoon patterns and glacial cycles far away from Africa itself. These weren't single bad years. They were sustained periods, sometimes lasting for millennia, where the landscape that early humans depended on for food, water, and shelter became dramatically less habitable. Lake beds that had supported large populations for generations dried into dust. Grasslands that had sustained herds of game animals contracted into small, disconnected patches. Under this model, the human population didn't crash because of one dramatic event. It crashed, slowly and repeatedly, because the environment across much of Africa became hostile to human survival for extended stretches, over and over, across tens of thousands of years. Small, isolated pockets of humans would have survived in what researchers sometimes call refugia, small regions where local geography, water sources, or microclimates allowed survival even while the surrounding areas became uninhabitable. Some evidence points to coastal regions of southern Africa as one of these refugia, where marine resources, shellfish, and coastal plant foods may have provided a stable enough food source to sustain small populations through periods when inland Africa was becoming steadily less survivable. This version of events doesn't have a single villain. There's no volcano to point to, no single dramatic moment you can put a date on and say, this is when we almost died. Instead, it's a slower, grinding kind of near extinction. One where the human species spent an enormous stretch of its early history clinging to survival in small, scattered pockets, while the vast majority of the landscape around them became empty of people, not because of one disaster, but because of a climate that simply stopped being livable for a very long time. And this actually fits the genetic evidence better than a single sharp catastrophe does. A single eruption predicts a sudden, sharp population crash, followed by relatively quick recovery once conditions improved. A prolonged climate instability period predicts something closer to what geneticists actually see, a population that stayed small and fragmented for an extended stretch of time, with genetic diversity slowly eroding not from one bad year, but from many, many generations of a small breeding population with limited contact between isolated groups. There's a deeper implication buried in this evidence, and it's worth sitting with for a second. If this model is closer to correct, then for a significant portion of our species' early history, humans weren't a thriving, expanding population slowly conquering the planet. We were a small number of isolated survivor groups, possibly numbering in the low thousands total, clinging to survival in a handful of refugia scattered across a continent, while the rest of that continent was, for us, essentially empty and unlivable. The confident expansionist story of human origins, the one where our ancestors marched out of Africa and across the globe with some kind of biological destiny behind them, sits on top of a much shakier foundation, a period where our entire lineage may have come extremely close to simply not making it. This also explains something else that's genuinely strange about human genetics, something separate from the low diversity itself. When researchers trace human mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, all of it traces back to a single common ancestor, a woman researchers have nicknamed Mitochondrial Eve, who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. This doesn't mean she was the only woman alive at the time, and it doesn't mean humanity started with one person. It means that every other maternal lineage that existed alongside her eventually died out, generation after generation, until hers was the only one left with unbroken descent to the present day. The same pattern holds for the Y chromosome, passed down through the paternal line, tracing back to a common male ancestor researchers have nicknamed Y chromosomal Adam. Neither of these figures met each other. They likely lived thousands of years apart, but both patterns point toward the same underlying reality, a population that went through repeated, severe bottlenecks, where most lineages, most family lines, simply didn't survive to pass anything forward. Put those two people side by side, and you get an uncomfortable picture, not of humanity confidently expanding from a single Adam and Eve-style origin point, but of an enormous, largely invisible die-off, repeated across thousands of generations, where line after line of ancestors ended, until only a small number of surviving threads remained to become every person alive today. So why does this matter now, beyond being an interesting historical footnote? Because it changes the framing of one of the most common assumptions people carry about evolution and human success. There's a popular, almost comforting version of the human story, where our rise was inevitable, where bigger brains and tool use and language put us on a track toward dominance that nothing could seriously threaten. The genetic and archaeological evidence tells a different story. For a significant stretch of our species' existence, we were closer to a rare, endangered species clinging to survival in scattered pockets than we were to an unstoppable evolutionary success story. The confidence we now have as a species, the sense that human beings are simply built to endure, sits on top of a period where that endurance was never guaranteed, and where the vast majority of our ancestral population, our relatives, our cousins, our alternate lineages, simply didn't make it. You are not the result of a species that always thrived. You're the result of a species that came close to disappearing, more than once, for reasons that are still only partly understood, and that somehow, against odds that the genetic record makes disturbingly clear, didn't.